still exists, and it is more prevalent than it has ever been.
Okay, so you spent a lot of time talking to both people who are basically trafficked, enslaved in many respects, both in the traffickers and in the consumers that end up, I guess, you know, exploiting these exploited people. Let's start with you know, those that you spoke to who are trafficked. Like, give us a sense of, I mean, is there a specific geographic location that people who are trafficked are coming from? Demographic, gender? What is there any through lines here, or just give us a sense of some that you spoke to that are indicative of this instance?
Well, at least in my research, I find that persons who are trafficked can come from all walks of life. However, there are certain populations who are at high risk. So, for example, marginalized individuals, victims of abuse as children, persons who are of the lower socioeconomic demographic, they can be at high risk. But human traffickers, the way that they target people is basically just looking for a void in somebody's life. And so the way that I set it up in my book is looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So at the very base level, we all are searching to meet our basic physiological needs. So food, shelter, water, so on and so forth. So, for example, a child who might be housing insecure or food insecure, or might be a runaway or homeless, they could be at risk for a trafficker pulling them into an exploited situation by making the false promise to fulfill those basic fundamental needs. At the higher levels, we have we search for safety and love and belonging and esteem, self-esteem. And so a human trafficker might look at somebody who might come from a higher socioeconomic background, who might have low self-esteem or not have that sense of love and belonging, and he might make the false promise to fulfill those basic needs. Or self-actualization, making false promises to, provide them economic opportunities to fulfill their dreams, whether they want to be an actress or a singer or a model, whatever the case may be. They're pretty much just creating a false narrative to put them in an exploited situation. So, for example, a migrant coming from one country to another, giving them an economic opportunity, but once they arrive, those economic opportunities that were promised are no longer available, and they're in an enslaved type of situation, working off of visa debt, so on and so forth. So pretty much, the population that I've interviewed, they have traversed different backgrounds, different demographics. Everybody's at risk, but I think there are certain populations that are definitely at higher risk than others.
All right. Well, so give me, just a specific example, case studies, because I'm curious. I think most people, when they think of people who are being enslaved or trafficked, either perceive someone who is here without documentation, or someone who is here with documentation that is controlled by an employer, right? And you write about this
Sure.
as well. What about? And I want to hear a case study or two of each of those, if there are any that stand out for you. But I'm also curious as to situations where do we have domestic trafficking?
Absolutely. We definitely have persons who are trafficked, who are American citizens, and that are trafficked within our own borders. And to give you a concrete example or an anecdote of that type of trafficking, I live in Northern Virginia, and one of the victims who I rescued, I witnessed her being victimized, being beaten at 1:30 in the afternoon on a Friday in front of Springfield Mall in Virginia. And so I write about this in a chapter of my book. I saw the man who was the driver throw her out, throw luggage at her. He ended up leaving. Long story short, this woman who was in her 30s, I picked her up and got to know her and got her narrative and got her situated in a safe space. But it turns out that she had been trafficked on and off for nearly 20 years. Her first sex trafficker was actually her mother's drug dealer. She had been trafficked on and off, and at times went to seek help, but sometimes she was arrested. So one of the headlines of one of the times that she was victimized, it says prostitute calls police on pimp. And at one point, she was even shot at point blank range in the leg by one of her sex traffickers. She was shot in the leg, requiring a vascular transfusion, but no one was ever arrested. The sex trafficker who I saw victimizing was actually down here in Virginia from the Northeast on a pretrial release for a malicious wounding against another one of his sex trafficking victims, but that charge was eventually dropped when the victim could no longer be located. So this woman, I mean, she was a U.S.-born citizen, but she had been sex trafficked. I mean, she had never known a conventional romantic relationship. They've always been sex traffickers who have used her, exploited her, abused her, and there were just so many missed opportunities for her rescue. So that's a concrete example of domestic sex trafficking. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we do have a number of people coming into the country without documentation. So given the militarization of our southern border, a lot more people are relying on smugglers. Over 90% of undocumented migrants are using smugglers. They're paying those smugglers between $5,000 to $10,000 US to come to the United States. But when you're relying on an illicit organized crime group to migrate you from one country to another, that group actually might be involved in human trafficking as well. So oftentimes what we'll see is once that undocumented migrant gets to the United States, they were deceived on the nature of the job that they're going to be provided, the compensation, or even just the migration fees will go from $10,000 to $20,000, and they'll be put in an indentured servitude type of situation. So those are two, I guess, case study type of examples of human trafficking that you will see within the United States.
And in that latter example, I mean, we're basically talking about sort of, I guess, some type of blackmail, right? And that I would imagine also, if you have people who came into the country with a working visa or a guest working type of situation, we're looking at blackmail. If you don't work this, if you don't work for me for free, or working off, theoretically you're working off your what you owe me, I'm going to turn you into the authorities. Is that basically what it is? I mean, it seems like it's either a financial or I guess emotional blackmail on some level.
I don't know if I would call it blackmail per se, but I mean, it is that they do have, I guess, a type of collateral. They are holding on to something that is of great importance to these undocumented individuals, but it's not just undocumented persons. So, for example, in my book, I talk about the trafficking of legal immigrants. So legal non-immigrants who are coming to our country on temporary visas as guest workers. We know that the employer holds an incredible amount of discretion and authority over them, holds on to sometimes their paperwork, houses them in deplorable conditions, sometimes will give them drugs to help them work longer and keep them indebted. So it's definitely an indentured servitude type of situation that does affect both undocumented populations, but also persons who come into the country legally as well. So I definitely think that they have some power and discretion that has not been addressed within our immigration policies, and that needs to be looked at with greater scrutiny, because it's something that we do see quite often.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos